She walked straight into the storm when every sane person was running from it. Rowan Mercer, 34 years old, 210 pounds of stubbornness wrapped in a worn canvas coat, had been told her whole life she was too much, too loud, too big, too difficult to love. She figured dying alone on a forgotten Oklahoma road was probably just the next thing she'd be too much for. She didn't know a man was already riding toward her through the black wall of dust. She didn't know that one act of desperate mercy was about to change two lives completely. If this story hit something real in you, like it, drop a comment, tell me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this one travels. The storm came in from the northwest the way bad news always did. Fast, without warning, and darker than anything the sky had a right to produce. Rowan Mercer saw it building on the horizon when she was still 3 miles outside of Hales Crossing, Oklahoma. A brown-black wall maybe 4,000 feet high, churning and rolling like something alive that hadn't eaten in a while. The kind of storm that old-timers called a haboob and everybody else called a reason to get inside. She watched it for a full 30 seconds, standing beside her truck on the cracked shoulder of Route 9, engine dead, radiator steaming. She'd been watching a lot of things lately that she couldn't do anything about. Well, she said to nobody, that's not good. The truck had given up the ghost about 2 miles back. She'd nursed it as far as she could on a cracked radiator hose and stubbornness, but the engine had finally seized with a sound like a man clearing his throat before delivering terrible news. She'd coasted to the shoulder, grabbed her pack, and started walking. There wasn't much else to do. There was never much else to do. She was 53 days out of Amarillo, where she'd worked 4 months at a feedlot that paid decent and asked no questions, which was the exact combination she'd been optimizing for most of her adult life. Before Amarillo, there'd been a grain elevator in western Kansas. Before that, a slaughterhouse outside Dodge City that she didn't like to think about. She moved when the work ran out or when the look started. Usually both happened around the same time. She was not, by any objective measure, the kind of woman who blended into a crowd. At 5 feet 11 inches and built like someone had assembled her from leftover parts meant for heavier work, Rowan Mercer occupied space in a way that made people uncomfortable. Not threatening, exactly. More like a piece of furniture that had been put in the wrong room. She had broad shoulders that filled out her coat to the seams, hands that could palm a basketball or wring out a mop with equal efficiency, and a face that had been called handsome by people trying to be kind and something less flattering by people who weren't. She kept her dark hair cut short on the sides, and she walked with a slight hitch in her left hip from an old injury that had healed wrong. She was not delicate. She had never been delicate. She had long since stopped mourning that. What she was tired. Not just the physical tired that a night's sleep could fix, though she was that too, but the other kind. The kind that settled into the bones and stayed there. The kind that came from years of arriving at places that were never quite right and leaving before they could tell you so. The storm hit before she made it another quarter mile. It came with a wall of sound first, a low, rushing roar that she felt in her chest before she heard it with her ears. Then the wind, which went from calm to 30 miles an hour in about 10 seconds, and then the darkness, a rolling curtain of dust and grit that swallowed the road and the sky and the world in one long, breathless moment. Rowan pulled her bandana over her nose and mouth, ducked her head, and kept walking. She couldn't see 2 feet in front of her face. The dust hit her skin like fine sandpaper, found every gap in her clothing, filled her ears and the corners of her eyes. She felt the road under her boots. Still there, still solid, and she followed it by feel, 1 foot in front of the other, arms out slightly for balance against the wind. She'd walked through worse, or she told herself she had. The problem came when the road turned. She missed it. The pavement curved left and she walked straight, and by the time she realized the ground under her feet had changed from asphalt to packed dirt. She'd gone maybe 50 yards in the wrong direction, and she had absolutely no idea which way right was anymore. The wind had shifted twice already. The dust was so thick she couldn't read the light, couldn't tell east from west or north from anything. She stopped, made herself stand still, which was harder than it sounded with the wind trying to peel her off the earth. She took 3 slow breaths through the bandana and tried to think. Going forward might put her deeper into open field. Going back might not be back. She could circle, but circles in zero visibility were just ways to get good and lost with extra steps. She stood there for probably 2 minutes, which felt considerably longer, and then her left knee buckled. Not dramatically, not like a movie fall, Just a quiet, private surrender. Her leg deciding it was done with this particular argument. She went down to one knee in the dirt, and the dust closed around her like a fist, and she knelt there in the dark with the wind screaming over her, and she thought, quite clearly and without particular drama, this might be it. She wasn't afraid exactly. That surprised her a little. More than afraid, she was tired, and more than tired, she was something she didn't have a precise word for. A kind of wistful sorry that this was the shape the ending took. A ditch somewhere on a road nobody used. Alone, like she'd been alone through most of it. She sat all the way down in the dirt, pulled her pack against her chest for something to hold on to, tucked her head down into the collar of her coat. She didn't know how long she stayed like that. The storm didn't let up. The wind kept screaming. At some point, she stopped feeling the cold. Brennan Hale had gone looking for a strayed fence post that his foreman Cal had mentioned that morning, which in retrospect was maybe the worst reason anyone had ever gone out on the open land with a storm building on the northwest horizon. He'd seen it coming. He wasn't stupid. He'd looked at that brown wall rolling in from the panhandle and thought, I should turn around. And then he'd thought about the strayed post and the section of fence that would come down without it, and the 6 cattle he couldn't afford to lose to the open range, and he'd kept riding. That was Brennan Hale in a nutshell, probably. He kept riding when he should turn around. He'd been doing it for 3 years, ever since his father died and left him this ranch that everybody in the county privately agreed was a dead man walking. Too much debt, too little yield, water rights tied up in a legal dispute that had been grinding through the courts since his grandfather's time. He was 38 years old, and he felt 60 sometimes, and he kept the feeling to himself. He was also not supposed to be on this particular stretch of road. He'd cut across the east pasture to check the section fence and come out farther south than he intended. And when the storm hit, he'd been following the fence line by touch, his horse Cooley moving slow and steady with her head down. Cooley was a good horse. She didn't panic in storms, which was more than Brennan could say for himself. He almost missed Rowan entirely. Cooley stopped, just stopped, dead in the middle of the road, and Brennan said, "Come on, girl," and nudged her with his knee, and she didn't move. She snorted once and turned her head to the right. Brennan squinted into the dark. There was a shape in the ditch, hunched against itself, not moving. He swung down from the saddle without thinking, ground-tied Cooley by habit, and made his way to the shape with one arm up against the wind. He crouched down, put his hand on what turned out to be a shoulder, broad, solid, a person, definitely a person, and said loud enough to cut through the storm, "Hey, hey, can you hear me?" The shape moved. "I hear you." The voice was rough, a little slow, but present. "Don't touch. I'm fine." "You're sitting in a ditch in a blackout storm," Brennan said. "That's not fine." "It's a setback," the voice said, and despite everything, despite the dust and the wind, and the 60 miles still between him and a solved fence problem, Brennan almost laughed. "Can you stand?" A pause. "Probably." "Let's try it." It took some doing. The person was bigger than he expected. He felt the weight of her as she pushed to her feet with one hand briefly on his arm, then immediately off it, like she didn't want to need the help any longer than strictly necessary. She was taller than him, broader through the shoulder. She moved like someone working through pain but not going to mention it. "My truck's dead about 2 miles back," she said, close to his ear to be heard over the wind. "I missed the road turn. Okay?" He took her arm this time, didn't ask permission. "Stay with me." She stiffened but didn't pull away. Getting back to Cooley was not elegant. The horse had stayed where she was, bless her, and Brennan got the woman's foot in the stirrup and her up into the saddle, then swung up behind and got them moving back toward the fence line and hopefully home. It was a long 20 minutes. Cooley put her head down and walked through it steady as a ship, and Brennan kept one hand on the reins and one arm braced in front of the woman he'd picked up, who sat ramrod straight and said nothing the entire ride. When they finally got to the barn and got the door shut against the wind, Brennan lit the lantern on the hook and got his first real look at her. She was somewhere in her mid-30s, broad-featured face, a cut on her chin from the grit, dark eyes that were red at the edges from the dust, hair plastered sideways from the wind. She was pulling the bandana down from her face and looking around the barn with the careful, systematic attention of someone who wanted to know where they were before they decided how to feel about being there. She looked at the horses, the hay storage, the hitch on the south wall, the empty grain bins in the corner. She took it all in without comment. Then she looked at him. "Thank you," she said. Flat, matter of fact, like she'd said it exactly as many times as she meant to. "Are you hurt?" "Cold. Nothing broken." She shifted her weight, and he caught the brief tightening around her eyes, her left side. "Maybe a little banged up." "Come inside. Get warm." She hesitated, long enough that he noticed. "I'm not going to bother you," he said. "There's a storm outside. You can't go anywhere tonight." "I know that," she said. I wasn't worried about that." She picked up her pack from where she'd set it down. "Lead the way." The ranch house was not in its best moment. Brennan saw it through her eyes as she came through the back door. The dishes stacked in the dry sink waiting to be washed, the layer of dust on the long table that hadn't been cleared since the wind had gotten through the gap around the window, the pots hanging on the wall hooks with the kind of careful ordering that meant someone had once cared very much about this kitchen, and that person had been gone a long time. His mother had left 5 years ago. Not died, Bob. Left. Gone to live with her sister in Tulsa, where the air was cleaner and nobody expected her to cook for 7 ranch hands and keep a house together with her bare hands. He didn't blame her. He'd have left too if he could have figured out how. He said, "I'll get the fire going," and went to the stove. The woman set her pack down on the floor by the door. Not on the bench, not on a chair, the floor, where she could grab it fast if she needed to. He noted that too. "I'm Brennan," he said, feeding kindling into the firebox. "Brennan Hale. This is my ranch. Rowan Mercer." She said it like it was information she was providing, not an introduction she was making. "Where were you headed, Rowan?" "North. There's a job posting in Woodward, feedlot work. I had a card for it." She sat down at the table, not in the chair closest to the door, but not at the far end either, middle. "My truck had other ideas." "How long you been driving on that radiator?" She looked at him sideways. "Since Elk City." He shook his head. "That's 60 miles. 62, she said. "I was optimistic about it." He got the fire going, put water on for coffee, found the tin of crackers he'd been meaning to restock and set it on the table in front of her without comment, because he was not an idiot, and she looked like she hadn't eaten since Elk City either. She ate 3 crackers in silence, then seemed to catch herself and stopped, and he said, "Eat them. There's more." And she ate 3 more, slower, like she was making herself slow down. "You run this place by yourself?" she asked. "Me and 5 hands." He sat down across from her with 2 cups of coffee. 6 sometimes. Depends on the season." "How many cattle?" 342 last count." He watched her face. "Angus, mostly. Some crossbreds." She nodded slowly. He couldn't read what she was thinking. "The barn looks stretched thin," she said. "Hay storage is low for this point in winter." He wrapped his hands around his cup. "Yeah." She didn't push it. He appreciated that. They sat in the kitchen with the wind hammering at the windows and the fire starting to push back the cold, and he asked her the things you asked a stranger. Where she was from, how long she'd been working cattle country, what her experience was. And she answered in the stripped-down, efficient way of someone who was used to being evaluated and didn't see the point in embellishment. She was from western Colorado originally. She'd been moving around for about 12 years. Feedlots, grain operations, some abattoir work. 2 years on a sheep operation in eastern New Mexico that she mentioned and then didn't elaborate on. She could cook. She said it offhandedly, the way you'd mention you knew how to drive a stick shift. Useful information, but not something she was proud of. "How many people?" she asked. "What?" "Your hands. How many men you're feeding tonight?" He studied her. 5 in the bunkhouse." "Why?" She stood up and went to the dry sink and started washing the stacked dishes. Just started, without asking, without preamble. He opened his mouth to say something and closed it again. "What do you have?" she asked, looking at the pantry door. "Rowan, you don't have to." "I know I don't have to." She turned and looked at him over her shoulder. "I was sitting in a ditch 45 minutes ago, thinking I might die there. You went out in a blackout storm and found me. The least I can do is feed your crew." A pause. "What do you have in the pantry?" He showed her. It wasn't much. 2 pounds of dried pinto beans, cornmeal, a smoked ham hock that he'd been saving for something, half a sack of onions, some garlic, canned tomatoes, a jar of lard. He stood in the doorway of the pantry, watching her inventory it all with quick eyes, moving things aside, checking behind. "This'll do," she said. "You don't have to make anything tonight. Storm's why they haven't eaten," she said. "How long have the beans been soaking?" "They haven't." She looked at him. "They've been in the bag," he said. She picked up the bag of pintos. "You got any broth?" "No." "Canned anything else?" "2 cans of tomatoes I showed you." She was quiet a moment, looking at the shelves. He watched her do some kind of internal calculation, rearranging the limits of what she had into something workable. "I need a big pot," she said finally. 2, if you have them." Cal Briggs had been foreman of the Hale spread for 11 years, and he was not easily surprised by anything, which was why he was standing in the kitchen doorway at 9:30 in the evening with an expression on his face that suggested genuine confusion. The kitchen smelled like something. That was the thing that had pulled him up from the bunkhouse in the first place. Smell traveling in the windbreak between buildings, something savory and warm that his body had registered before his brain caught up. He told himself he was coming to check on Brennan. He'd been mostly lying to himself. The woman at the stove was someone he'd never seen before. She had her back to him, stirring something in the big cast-iron pot that hadn't been used in about 2 years. She moved around the kitchen with the efficiency of someone who'd worked in other people's kitchens all her life. Not hurried, not showy, just utterly certain of where everything was, which was impressive given that she'd presumably found out where everything was in the last 2 hours. Brennan was at the table eating cornbread from a skillet that had also not been used in considerable time. "Who's that?" Cal said. "Rowan Mercer," Brennan said. "Found her in a ditch on the South Road during the storm." "Found her in a—" Cal stopped. "You went out during the storm?" "Fence post," Brennan said, which answered nothing. Rowan turned from the stove without particular hurry. She looked Cal over the way he was looking at her. Straightforward assessment, no apology for it. "You're the foreman," she said. Not a question. "Cal Briggs, you eat before you came up here?" "No, ma'am." "Sit down." She turned back to the stove. "Beans need another 20 minutes, but I've got cornbread and there's ham left." Cal sat down. He did it mostly on reflex, which said something about the authority in her voice. He looked at Brennan, who shrugged and tore another piece of cornbread. "She can cook," Brennan said quietly, unnecessarily. "I can see that," Cal said. At 10:15, Rowan carried the pot across the yard to the bunkhouse herself, not asking for help and not getting any because nobody thought to offer it before she was already halfway there. Cal came behind her with the cornbread and a ladle. Brennan brought cups and the remaining coffee. The bunkhouse had 4 men in it. Jesse Dunn, who was 19 and perpetually hungry. Pete Rawlings, who was 40-something and said about 30 words a day on a talkative day. Theo Marsh, who was 26 and had been on the Hale spread 8 months and was already thinking about leaving. And Danny Cho, who was 23 and had come up from his family's place in Texas and didn't quite fit anywhere yet, which was a thing Rowan recognized on sight. She set the pot on the table and stood back and watched them serve themselves. And she didn't say anything about how fast Jesse filled his bowl or the way Pete looked at the food before he picked up his spoon, like he was making sure it was real. Danny looked up at her while he was eating. "This has got actual flavor," he said, like he was surprised. "Beans aren't hard," Rowan said. "You just have to pay attention to them. We haven't had hot food in the bunkhouse since—" Danny looked at Cal. 3 weeks, Cal said. Rowan said nothing to that, but she looked at the pot and then at the 5 men eating from it, and something crossed her face that she didn't quite manage to keep off it. Not pity exactly. Something more like recognition. She knew what it meant to go without. She knew what it did to a person's sense of what they deserved. She picked up the ladle and filled Danny's bowl again without being asked. The storm broke sometime past midnight. The silence it left behind was enormous, the way silences always were after that much noise. Rowan lay on the narrow cot in the spare room Brennan had made up for her and stared at the ceiling and listened to the ranch settle around her. The creak of the old house, the sound of wind still high up but not at ground level anymore, a horse shifting in the barn. She'd been in a lot of spare rooms, a lot of cots in a lot of houses and bunkhouses and seasonal camps. She knew how to map a space by its sounds, where the exits were, how far to the door, what the night sounds meant about the people in the place. This house sounded tired. That was the first thing. The weariness wasn't just Brennan's. It was in the walls, in the way the floors breathed, in the silence from the kitchen where someone's ghost still lived in the pothooks and the scrubbed pine of the cutting table. This house had been a home once, and it remembered that and didn't quite know what it was now. She thought about what she'd seen: the low hay, the dry sink stacked with dishes that nobody had gotten to, the cornmeal that was more than half gone, the way Cal had looked at a pot of beans like they were something significant. She thought about what she hadn't been told yet but could read clearly enough: the debt, the kind of ranch that kept running on stubbornness and not enough else. She'd seen it before: good land in bad years, ownership too proud to admit what was coming until it was already here. She'd be gone by morning, get her truck towed, find a way to Woodward, start at the feedlot. That was the plan. That was what she did. She lay there with her hands folded on her chest and thought about beans and cornbread and 5 men eating like they'd forgotten they were allowed to. She turned on her side and closed her eyes. She told herself she'd be gone by morning. She was still there at 6:15 when Brennan came down to the kitchen and found coffee already made and the stove going, and Rowan at the table with a notebook she'd produced from somewhere in her pack, writing something in a small, tight hand. He stopped in the doorway. She looked up. "Sit down," she said. "I need to talk to you about your kitchen." He sat down. She pushed a cup of coffee across the table. "You've got enough to make a real supply run worth doing," she said, "if you add the right basics: flour, baking powder, dried pasta, more beans, a sack of rice." She turned the notebook so he could see. "With 5 hands and a haul like that, you can run 2 weeks of full meals without repeating a protein. You're not out of money yet, or you'd have sold the cattle." He looked at the list, then at her. "You're not going to Woodward this morning." "I can't, my truck." "My offer," he said carefully, "isn't about your truck." He wrapped his hands around the cup. "I can't pay you what that feedlot job would pay, but I can give you room and board and something fair on top of it. And what I actually need is someone who can hold this crew together through the next few weeks while I figure out what we're doing." She was quiet. He pressed it because he was already in it. "Cal's a good foreman, but he's running on empty. The men are demoralized, and He stopped. "I can't fix the food problem and the money problem at the same time by myself. I'm not good at everything." "What are you good at?" she asked. Not challenging, genuine. "Cattle," he said. "I know cattle. I know this land. I don't know how to make people feel like it's worth staying." Rowan looked at her notebook, at his list, back at him. 2 weeks, she said. 2 weeks, he agreed. She picked up her pen and went back to the list. "I'm going to need a proper inventory of your pantry, and someone needs to reseason that cast iron before I use it again, or we're all going to regret it." Brennan drank his coffee and felt, for the first time in a long time, that something in the house was breathing right again. He didn't say that. He was also not good at saying things like that out loud, but he thought it. The first full day was a negotiation between Rowan and a kitchen that had given up. The stove had a hot spot on the left side that ran too high. The oven door didn't seal completely and leaked heat. The big cast iron, the one she'd used the night before, had a thin skin of rust along the inside that needed burning off and reseasoning before it was going to behave. The knife block had 4 knives, 2 of which were useful, and 2 of which she set aside without comment. She worked through it methodically, the way she worked through every obstacle. Assess, prioritize, start with what you can fix. Jesse Dunn showed up at the kitchen door at 7:30, hat in hand, and said, "Cal sent me to ask what you needed for the supply run." He was 19 and trying hard to look older than he was. He had a good-natured face and the gangly, not quite finished quality of someone who'd been put to work before he was entirely done growing into himself. "Come in," Rowan said. "Stop standing in the doorway." He came in. "Can you reach that top shelf?" She pointed. He could, barely. He got down the tin she was pointing at, salt, mostly empty, and handed it to her. "You handy?" she asked. "Ma'am?" "Around a kitchen. Can you cut vegetables without losing fingers? You know how to keep a fire even?" He blinked. "I can learn." "Good." She handed him a knife. "Onions first. Don't cry on them." He stared at the knife, then at her, then started on the onions. He cried on them a little. He didn't mention it, and neither did she. By mid-morning, she had three things sorted: the stove, the cast iron, and Jesse, who turned out to be genuinely useful once he understood that the kitchen was not a place she was going to be patient about half measures. He stacked firewood correctly when she showed him why the other way was slower to catch. He learned the difference between a simmer and a boil without being told twice. He had good instincts about taste, which surprised her. "You've cooked before," she said. "For my family," he said, "when my mom was sick. I was 13. She didn't say anything about that. She handed him a wooden spoon and told him to keep stirring. At noon, she sent food to the bunkhouse. A pot of thick soup made with the ham hock bones she'd rendered out, barley she'd found behind a bag of cornmeal, and enough root vegetables to fill a man up for an afternoon of work. She'd made biscuits, real ones, not the flat things she'd seen evidence of in the empty cardboard box in the dry sink. Pete Rawlings, the quiet one, the 40-something, ate 2 bowls and then sat for a moment with his hands around his cup of coffee and looked at the table. "First proper meal I've had at this ranch in I don't know how long," he said. He was talking to Cal, not to Rowan, who was over by the door. But she heard it. Cal said, "Yeah." "Makes a difference," Pete said. Then he put his hat on and went back to work. Theo Marsh had been watching Rowan all day with the careful eyes of someone who'd decided not to make up his mind yet. He was the one who was thinking about leaving. She could feel it on him, that quality of someone keeping their options open, not unpacking all the way. That afternoon, she asked him to help her move a shelf unit in the pantry, and he did it without comment, efficient and quiet. "How long you been here?" she asked. 8 months? "What made you stay this long?" He looked at her sideways. Nothing better came along. "That's honest. Is it wrong?" She considered the shelf they'd just moved. "No," she said. "But there's a difference between staying because there's nothing better and staying because this place has something worth fighting for." Theo was quiet. He picked up the empty box she'd been about to ask him to move and carried it out without being asked. She didn't know if that meant anything, but she noted it. By the end of the first week, the kitchen had become something different, not transformed. She didn't believe in transformations, which struck her as mostly wishful thinking, but altered, functional in a way it hadn't been. The stove ran even. The pantry had been restocked on the supply run that Cal had done with Jesse, and she'd given him a list so specific that he'd come back with almost everything on it, which he found mildly alarming and slightly impressive. Meals happened, real ones. Breakfast at 6, dinner at noon, supper in the evening, and the food was the kind of food that reminded a person that eating was not just fuel, it was the thing you came in from the cold for. It was the center of something. She made chili from scratch on the 3rd day. She made cornbread that Jesse now knew how to make himself. She made a beef stew on day 5 that used the last of the tougher cuts she'd found in the cold storage, braised down with onions and tomatoes until the meat gave up its resistance. Danny Cho took his first bite and sat there a moment and then said quietly, "My grandmother makes something like this." He said it to the table, not to anyone in particular. Rowan was washing a pot at the sink. She said, over her shoulder, "What's her version have in it?" He told her. She asked 2 more questions. He answered. By the end of it, he'd talked more in 10 minutes than she'd heard from him in a week. And when he went back to the bunkhouse, his walk was a little different. Not fixed, nothing was fixed, but something had been acknowledged. These were not comfortable men. They were men living in a situation that was eroding, and they knew it, and they'd been living with that knowledge and doing the work anyway, which was its own kind of courage that didn't get named very often. The food didn't solve anything. She was clear-eyed about that. What it did was give them something to gather around. A reason to sit down together that wasn't purely exhaustion. Something to look forward to in the middle of a day that didn't have a lot of reasons to look forward. She saw Brennan watching it sometimes. He'd come into the bunkhouse for supper and stand by the wall with his plate and watch his crew sitting together at the table, talking, occasionally, even laughing once or twice, with the expression of a man who hadn't been sure there was anything left worth watching and was now in the process of revising that assessment. He was careful with her. She noticed that. He didn't crowd her, didn't make demands, didn't try to fill silence with talk when silence was what was needed. He had a habit of appearing in the kitchen at the end of the evening when she was cleaning up, ostensibly for something he'd forgotten. Actually, she suspected, because he was keeping tabs on whether she was doing all right. She didn't call him on it. She thought it was decent of him. One evening, near the end of the first week, she found him in the kitchen at 10 o'clock, staring at a ledger with the expression of a man staring at a message he'd been hoping might say something different if he read it enough times. She put a cup of coffee down next to him without comment. He looked up. "That bad?" she asked. He looked at the ledger, back at her. He seemed to be deciding something. "I owe the bank $43,000, he said. "The note comes due in 60 days. I've got 6 weeks of operating money left, maybe 7, if we're careful." He closed the ledger. "And the cattle prices in this county haven't been worth driving to market for 2 years because the only buyer within hauling distance is old Bert Comstock. And Bert Comstock pays whatever he wants to pay because there's nobody else." Rowan was quiet. "Where's the nearest buyer who pays fair value?" she asked. He looked at her. "Wichita, there's a contractor up there, Hendricks Livestock. They pay market rate, but it's 160 miles, and I'd have to drive the herd because I can't afford transport." "How many head?" "I'd need to sell about 200 to make the payment." She sat down across from him and looked at the ledger cover, at his hands on top of it. 200 cattle, she said, 160 miles. You'd need good weather and enough hands and somebody who knows the route. "I'd need a lot of things," he said. She looked at the ledger. "Tell me about the route," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he got up and came back with a map. The map was old, creased at the folds so many times that the paper had gone soft as cloth in those places, and 2 of the county lines had faded to ghost marks that Brennan had retraced in pencil at some point. He spread it across the table between them and put his coffee cup on one corner to hold it flat, and Rowan leaned forward with her elbows on the table and looked at it the way she looked at everything, like she was going to find the truth in it whether it wanted to give it up or not. "We'd come out of the east pasture here," Brennan said, pointing. "Pick up the old cattle trail that runs parallel to Route 9 for the first 40 miles. It's not maintained, but the ground is solid enough in dry weather." He traced the line north. "Then we cross the river at the Dunn Ford. Shallow crossing, good rock bottom. And from there, it's open range through the Osage Flats. Another 60 miles to the Hendricks yard outside Wichita." Rowan studied the route. Her finger moved to a section just past the river crossing. "What's this terrain?" "Rolling grassland mostly, some drainage cuts." "How deep?" "Depends on recent rain. This time of year probably manageable." "Probably," she said. He didn't argue with her reading of that word. "There's a section about 30 miles out of Wichita where the land gets rough. Some old creek beds, rocky. You can lose cattle in there if you're not watching." "How many days total?" 7, maybe 8 if weather slows us." Rowan was quiet, running the math. 7 days with 200 head of cattle and, she counted, 5 ranch hands, one of whom was 19 and had only just learned to keep a kitchen fire even. Across 160 miles of Oklahoma and Kansas range, in weather that this time of year could turn hostile in 4 hours with no warning. "Who drove the last time?" she asked. Brennan's jaw tightened slightly. "My father, 8 years ago." She looked at him. "You weren't on it?" "I was in Tulsa. I came back 6 months later." He folded the edge of the map back down. "After things had gotten worse." She didn't push on that. She recognized the shape of that particular regret, the kind that had already been argued over in a man's own head so many times it had worn grooves, and she knew there was nothing useful she could add to it. "Cal's driven cattle before," she said. It wasn't a question. She'd heard enough in the bunkhouse to know that Cal Briggs had done almost every kind of ranch work there was, usually in the service of someone else's operation. "Yeah, he knows the work." Brennan paused. "What he doesn't know is whether it's worth it. Whether anything's worth it right now. That's the problem." He looked at the map. When men think they're working for something that's already lost, they don't work the same way. Rowan sat back. Outside the kitchen window, the Oklahoma night was wide open and cold, the stars back out hard and bright after the storm had scrubbed the sky clean. She could hear the horses in the barn. Somewhere distant, a coyote made its dry, lonely sound and stopped. "Let me talk to Cal," she said. Brennan looked at her. "About what?" "About what's worth fighting for." He was quiet a moment. "Cal doesn't open up easy." "I know," she said. "Neither do I." She found Cal the next morning at the fence line on the north pasture, replacing a post that the storm had tilted. He was doing it methodically, the way he did everything. No wasted motion, no hurry, just a steady competence that had probably kept this ranch from complete collapse for longer than Brennan knew. She brought him coffee in a battered tin cup and handed it to him without preamble. He took it without particular surprise, like women appearing at fence lines with coffee was a thing that happened to him regularly. She suspected it was not. "Brennan showed me the route to Wichita," she said. "Cal drove the post bar into the ground once, hard." "Did he?" "He's thinking about a drive." "He's been thinking about a drive for 2 years." Cal set the bar down and picked up the cup. "Thinking about it's different from doing it." "What would it take to make it doable?" He looked at her over the rim of the cup. He had the kind of face that had been worn down to its essential parts by weather and years. Not old exactly, but stripped of anything that wasn't load-bearing. She liked that in a face. "You want the real answer or the polite one?" he said. "I've never needed the polite one." He drank the coffee, set the cup down on the fence post. "We're 2 hands short of what I'd want for a herd that size on that terrain. The horses are in decent shape, but 2 of them are green for drive work. Jesse's never been on anything longer than a day run." He paused. "And Theo's half checked out. He's got 1 foot toward the door, and I don't know if he'd pull through when it got hard." "And you?" she asked. He picked up the post bar again. "What about me? You think it's worth trying?" He was quiet long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. Then he said, "When Brennan's father was running this place, this ranch turned out good cattle, and the men who worked here were proud of what they did. That's not nothing. That doesn't come back easy once it goes." He drove the bar into the ground again. "I think there's something still here worth saving. I don't know if we've got enough left to save it." "That's not a no," Rowan said. "It's not a yes either." "I'll take it," she said, and picked up the empty cup and walked back toward the house. The conversation that changed things happened on day 10, between Rowan and Theo Marsh, in the cold storage behind the bunkhouse where she was doing a count of the remaining beef cuts. She'd known he'd been watching her. She'd let him, because she understood the calculation he was running. This woman appeared out of nowhere and is now seemingly running things. So what's her angle? What does she want? And is she going to be here when it matters? These were not unreasonable questions. She'd have asked them herself. He appeared in the doorway with his hands in his jacket pockets, and she kept counting and said, "Boss, close the door. You're letting the cold air in." He closed it, stood there. "Say what you came to say," she said. "I'm not sure what that is yet." She made a note in her small book. "How long are you planning to stay?" Silence. "You've got that look," she said, "like a man with a bag half packed under his bunk." "That's—" He stopped. "I don't have a bag packed." "Not yet." She turned and looked at him. "What's keeping you?" He shifted his weight. "I don't know. Maybe nothing." "Maybe something," she said. He looked at the shelving, at the hanging cuts. "I came to this ranch because I needed work, and it had work. That's the whole reason." He said it like he was challenging her to find fault with it. "I don't have some deep loyalty thing. This isn't my family's place." "Nobody said it has to be your family's place." "Then why does it feel like—" He stopped again, frustrated. "Like what?" He looked at her. Like leaving would mean something. She let that sit in the air a moment. She went back to her count. "Because it would," she said. "Not because the ranch needs you specifically. Because you know what's coming and you know the men that'd be left to deal with it. And you know you could help." She turned a page in the book. "That's not loyalty to a place. That's loyalty to people, which is a different thing." Theo was quiet for a long time. "What do you actually think's going to happen here?" he finally said. "With the debt. The bank." She closed the notebook. "I think if Brennan drives those cattle to Wichita and gets fair value, he makes the payment. I think if he doesn't, the bank forecloses by spring." She looked at Theo straight. "I think the crew that does that drive together, even if it's hard, will be different men on the other side of it, for better or worse." He chewed on that. "And you?" he said. "You're going to be on that drive?" She'd been asking herself that question for 3 days. She hadn't fully answered it yet. "I'm deciding," she said, which was more honest than she usually was. He nodded slowly. He looked at the cold storage shelves one more time and then at her. "If you decide yes," he said, "I'm in." He left. She stood alone in the cold storage and wrote nothing for a moment, just held the pen above the page. Then she wrote, "Drive, tall, 200 head, 8 days, all hands." She closed the notebook. The banker came on a Thursday, 2 weeks to the day after Rowan had walked out of that storm and into this kitchen. His name was Gerald Watts, and he had driven out from Kingfisher in a truck that was newer and cleaner than anything on the Hale property by a considerable margin. And he had the specific quality of a man who had delivered bad news enough times that he'd stopped thinking of it as bad news and started thinking of it as business. Rowan was in the kitchen when she heard the truck pull up. She watched through the window as Brennan came out of the barn and met him in the yard. She couldn't hear the words from this distance, but she could read the body language fine. Watts had his thumbs in his jacket pockets, which was the stance of a man who believed the conversation was already settled. Brennan stood with his arms crossed, which was the stance of a man who was trying to look more settled than he was. They went inside to the front room. Rowan kept working. Cal appeared in the kitchen doorway 20 minutes later with the face he made when things were bad. "How bad?" she said. "Watts is saying the note is technically callable now. Some clause Brennan's father signed that says if land value drops below the loan threshold." Cal stopped. "It's complicated." And Watts says he's willing to work with Brennan if Brennan sells the South herd to Comstock at Comstock's rate and uses that to make a partial payment. Cal's jaw was tight. At Comstock's rate, it covers maybe 2/3 of what's owed. Then Watts refinances the rest at a higher interest rate, and the ranch is on the hook for the next 10 years. Rowan set down the wooden spoon she'd been holding. "Or," she said, "or Watts moves to foreclose in 45 days. She wiped her hands on the dish towel. "Where's Brennan?" "Still with Watts." She went to the doorway between the kitchen and the hallway. She could hear voices from the front room. Watts's smooth and even. Brennan's lower and controlled in the way of a man controlling himself very deliberately. She went back to the kitchen. She stood at the counter and thought. She was not someone who walked into other people's rooms uninvited. She had a deep bone-level resistance to inserting herself into situations that were not hers to insert herself into. It had taken her this long, 2 weeks in someone else's house, cooking someone else's cruise food, before she'd started to feel like she had any standing here at all. But she'd looked at that map. She'd done the math, and she'd listened to 5 men eat at a table and start to remember what it felt like to have something to come back to. She picked up 2 cups of coffee and walked down the hall. The front room had a low ceiling and a cold fireplace and a desk along one wall that was covered in papers Brennan had been stacking and restacking for weeks. Watts was standing near the window, not sitting, which was deliberate. Standing kept him above the negotiation. Brennan was at the desk, and he looked up when Rowan came in with something in his eyes that was not quite relief and not quite alarm. Watts looked at her with the politely blank expression of a man who had not expected a woman to enter this room. She set 1 cup of coffee on the desk in front of Brennan. She kept the other. "Mr. Watts," she said, "I'm Rowan Mercer. I've been helping manage the operation here." Watts glanced at Brennan, then back at her. "Is that so? I heard you talking about the South herd going to Bert Comstock." She didn't apologize for having heard it. "What's Comstock paying per head right now?" Watts blinked. "That's really a matter between—" "Brennan?" she said. Brennan's mouth twitched very slightly. $48, he said. She looked at Watts. "Hendricks Livestock in Wichita is paying $62. Watts' expression didn't change exactly, but something behind it did. "Hendricks is 160 miles away." "Yes, it is," she said. "You're talking about a cattle drive in November. Early November, weather windows still open." She held the cup. "The math is different if you're getting 62 instead of 48. Significantly different." Watts looked at her with the careful look of a man recalculating. "Even if you could drive the cattle there, which is a considerable if, you'd be looking at what, 7 days? 8? The note clause doesn't—" "The note clause," Rowan said, "is the clause your bank added to a loan that was refinanced in 1987, and from what I understand of it, it's triggered only if the assessed land value drops below 80% of the loan principal." She paused. "Has there been a reassessment?" Watts was quiet. Brennan was looking at her. Because if there hasn't been a formal reassessment, she said, I'm not sure the clause is technically triggered yet. Watts's expression had moved through blank into something that was less comfortable. You're not a lawyer, Ms. Mercer. No, she agreed. But I'd suggest Brennan talk to one before he signs anything. The room was quiet for a moment. The cold fireplace ticked. Outside, she could hear one of the horses moving in the yard. Watts smiled. It was the kind of smile that didn't reach anything above the chin. Of course, he said. He picked up his hat from the chair. Mr. Hale, I'll give you a few more days to consider your options. We'll be in touch. He left. Rowan heard the front door close, heard the truck start, heard it pull out of the yard. She stood in the front room with her coffee and didn't say anything. Brennan exhaled, long and slow. He turned the coffee cup on the desk without picking it up. Was that true, he said, about the reassessment clause? It's what I read in the copy of the note you left on the desk last Tuesday, she said. He looked at her. You shouldn't leave legal documents out where people can read them, she said. Unless you want people to read them. He was quiet for a moment. Then, maybe I did. She went back toward the kitchen. At the doorway, she stopped. Brennan? She turned. The window for that drive is real, but it's not wide. We'd have to leave within the week. He rubbed the back of his neck. I know. Your crew needs to hear it from you, not from me. From you. She looked at him. They'll go, but they need to hear that you believe in it. He looked at the desk, at the papers, at the window where Watts's truck had been. I do believe in it, he said. Then say it like that, she said, and left him to it. Brennan called the crew together that evening after supper in the bunkhouse, which was the right place to do it. Their space, not his. Rowan stayed in the kitchen because it wasn't her speech to be present for. But the bunkhouse was close enough that she heard some of it through the wall when voices rose. She heard Brennan's voice, low and steady, for several minutes. She heard Cal say something she couldn't make out. She heard Jesse's voice, higher, with a question in it. She heard nothing from Theo or Pete or Danny for a while. And then she heard Theo's voice, brief and flat. And whatever he said was followed by a silence, and then what she thought might be Cal laughing, which was rare enough to be notable. An hour later, Brennan came into the kitchen. We're going, he said. She was already writing the supply list. I know, she said. I've been making the list for a week. He stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at her with an expression she couldn't entirely name. Something that was trying to figure her out, and had mostly given up on that project, and had settled instead into something more like trust, which was different and in some ways harder. Rowan, he said, why are you still here? She kept writing. 'Cause somebody's got to make sure Jesse doesn't set the camp on fire. He was quiet. And because, she said without looking up, the drive needs a camp cook, somebody to keep the crew fed and functional for 8 days on the road. She finished the line she was writing. That's not a soft job. That's as important as any position on the line. I know it is. Then stop asking why I'm still here, she said, and go make sure Cal has the right horses sorted for the drive. He went. She could hear him cross the yard toward the barn, his boots on the cold ground, the barn door swinging. She looked at her list, at the miles between this kitchen and Wichita, at the weather that was holding for now and wouldn't hold forever. She added flour to the list. More beans, dried apples, 2 extra cast iron lids. Outside, the Oklahoma sky was turning toward night, going deep blue at the edges, the stars beginning to come through. The wind had dropped. The horses were in. The ranch smelled like hay and cold air and the wood smoke coming from the bunkhouse stove, and it was exactly the smell of a place that was still alive and still fighting and didn't know yet whether it was going to make it. Rowan finished her list. She put the pen down. She sat for a moment in the quiet kitchen with her hands flat on the table and felt, not peace exactly, she wasn't the kind of woman who felt peace, but something in the neighborhood of it. A settling. A sense of having made a decision that was going to be hard and was going to be right. She'd told Theo she was still deciding. She'd been lying. She'd decided the same night she looked at that map. She just hadn't been ready to say it yet. They left on a Tuesday, before first light. Rowan had been up since 4, loading the camp wagon with the systematic efficiency of someone who had thought through every contingency twice and was now executing the list in order. 2 cast iron pots, both lids. The flour, the beans, the dried apples. Coffee. Enough for 8 days with a margin for the days that went long. Salt pork wrapped in cloth. A crate of cornmeal. The medical kit she'd restocked herself because the original had been missing half its contents, and what remained was outdated in ways that worried her. Jesse was supposed to help load. He appeared at 4:45, still pulling on his jacket, his hair sideways from sleep. "You're late," she said. "It's not even 5. "The cattle don't know that." She handed him a crate. "Put that behind the seat, not on top." He put it behind the seat. He was learning. By 5:30, the herd was moving. 206 head of Angus and crossbred cattle, sorted from the rest the previous day by Cal and Theo and Pete working a gate system that had taken most of the afternoon to execute cleanly. The cattle moved in that particular slow ocean way of large herds, the lead animals picking up the direction, the body following with a kind of massive, reluctant momentum, the drag end needing constant pressure from the riders to keep it closed up. Cal rode point. Theo and Pete worked the flanks. Danny Cho took the drag position, which was the worst position. Dust, smell, the most stubborn animals, the most work. And he'd taken it without complaint when Cal assigned it, which moved him several notches in Rowan's estimation. Brennan rode a circuit between all of them, checking, adjusting, doing the thing a good ranch owner did, which was making sure everyone had what they needed before they needed to ask for it. Rowan drove the camp wagon. Jesse rode beside her on a young bay gelding named Scratch, who was only barely sure about all of this. The Oklahoma morning came up slow and cold, orange light pushing in from the east across flat land that seemed to go on forever in every direction. The herd moved north through it like a dark river finding its course. Nobody talked much in the first hour. There was a quality to those early morning miles that didn't invite conversation. The sound of hooves and the creak of wagon and the breathing of animals. The land opening up ahead, the ranch getting smaller in the rearview mirror until it was just a smudge of roof lines and a windmill against the early sky. Rowan watched it go and felt something she didn't examine too carefully. "You think we'll make it?" Jesse said. He was looking ahead, not at her. "Ask me on day 6, she said. That's not reassuring." "It's not supposed to be reassuring. It's supposed to be honest." He rode quiet for a moment. Scratch flicked an ear at a bird that came up from the grass, and Jesse steadied him without thinking about it, which was better instinct than he'd had 2 weeks ago. "What happens if we don't make it?" he said. Rowan kept her eyes on the trail ahead. "Then we deal with whatever comes." That's also not reassuring. "Jesse," she said, "you're going to have to stop asking me to reassure you and start paying attention to what's in front of you. That's going to get you a lot further." He shut up. She thought she'd been too hard on him, and then decided she probably hadn't been hard enough because what was in front of them was 160 miles of November range, and this was not the time for soft edges. The first 3 days were the kind of hard that was manageable. Not easy. Nothing about moving 200 cattle across open land in the tail end of autumn was easy, but the kind of hard that had a rhythm to it, that settled into the body and became familiar. The weather held. The ground was dry, which meant the cattle moved well and didn't bog in soft soil. The route Cal knew from memory and Brennan had studied from the map proved navigable, the trail parallel to Route 9 exactly as described, rough but passable, wide enough for the herd to spread and narrow enough to keep them from scattering. Camp went up each evening in about 40 minutes. Rowan worked with the efficiency of someone who had decided that efficiency was a form of respect for the people who were going to eat and sleep and rise and do it again tomorrow. Fire first, always. Get the fire going before anything else, because everything ran off that. Then the pot, water from whatever source was nearest, the beans or the stew or the rice going in while she put up the supply tarp and sorted what was needed for the morning. The men came into camp hungry and tired, and they ate without ceremony, and they slept hard. That was the right rhythm. She'd seen crews get ragged when the meals were poor or irregular, seen the way hunger turned to irritability and irritability to conflict and conflict to the kind of fractures that broke drives apart. She kept the food consistent, not fancy. Nothing out here could be fancy, but hot and filling and on time, which mattered more than anything else. On the second night, Pete Rawlings sat by the fire after the others had turned in and didn't leave, which was unusual. He was a man who went to sleep as soon as he'd finished eating, as regular as a clock. Rowan was cleaning the pot. She let him sit. After a while he said, "I worked a drive in Montana, 1987. Big operation, 600 head." She kept working. "How was it?" "Long." He turned his cup in his hands. Cook on that drive was a mean old man named Baxter who made the same thing every single night, salt pork and hardtack and beans. He paused. "I still have dreams about it sometimes. Not good ones." "I'm not going to do that to you," she said. "No," he agreed. "You're not." He drank the last of his coffee. "I just wanted to say, the difference matters." She looked at him, Pete Rawlings, who said 30 words a day on a talkative day. "Thank you," she said. He nodded and went to his bedroll. She stayed by the fire a few minutes after, listening to the cattle settle in the dark beyond the camp perimeter, the occasional low sound of them moving, the night sounds of the land. The sky out here was enormous. It pressed down with its weight of stars, and she sat under it and felt small in a way that was not entirely unpleasant. The storm arrived on day 4 without meaningful warning. The morning had been clear. That was the thing that made it worse. A clear morning with good light and the herd moving well, Cal saying over breakfast that they were maybe half a day ahead of schedule. Rowan had noticed the quality of the light changing around 10 o'clock, the way it went from clean to thick, and she'd watched the northwest without saying anything because she wasn't sure yet. By noon, she was sure. "Brennan!" She pulled the wagon up beside where he was riding. "Look northwest." He looked. The same brown-black wall she'd walked into 2 weeks ago, but bigger. Or maybe distance just made it look bigger. Either way, it was coming, and it was coming fast. "How far?" he said. "Hour. Maybe less." He looked at Cal, who had ridden up on the other side. Cal was reading the same sky. "We can't outrun it," Cal said. "No," Brennan said. "We hold. Get the herd tight and hold." He turned his horse. "Cal, pull the flanks in. Theo, Danny, get on the drag and push them close. Jesse." He looked at Jesse, who had gone a particular shade of pale. "Jesse, stay with the wagon." "I can help with the—" "Stay with the wagon," Brennan said, not unkindly. "If the wagon goes, we've got no camp. Keep the horses tied and get the tarp down over the supplies." Jesse nodded and wheeled back. What happened in the next 40 minutes was not a disaster, but it was the closest thing to one that still fell short of the word. The storm hit with the same wall of dust and force she'd experienced on that road 2 weeks ago, but this time there were 200 cattle in the equation, and cattle in a blackout storm were a different proposition than a woman in a ditch. The herd didn't full stampede. Cal and Theo got the flanks collapsed before the worst hit, and the lead animals held reasonably. But the drag end blew apart. The dust hit, and the wind hit, and 40, maybe 50 cattle at the rear of the herd simply scattered into the brown dark, going in whatever direction the wind wasn't, which was south and east and into terrain that didn't invite easy retrieval. Rowan had the wagon brake set and the supply tarp tied down, and both wagon horses blindfolded with strips of cloth before the storm fully closed in. Jesse was beside her, doing what she told him, moving fast and without wasted motion, and she thought, not for the first time, that the kid had more in him than he knew. They waited in the dark. The wind screamed. Dust found every gap in the canvas. She sat on the wagon bench with her bandana up and her eyes closed, and she listened for the cattle and the riders and tried to track from sound what was happening out there, which was mostly impossible. It lasted an hour and 10 minutes. When the storm passed, it left the trail looking like a different place. Redistributed dirt, the grass beaten flat, the light that strange, washed quality that came after hard weather. Rowan pulled the bandana down and looked. Cal was visible, about 200 yards north, still on his horse. Brennan was closer, riding back toward the wagon. The main body of the herd had held. She could see them, maybe 150 head, milling and unsettled but present. The drag end was gone. "How many?" Brennan said when he reached her. His face was gray with dust. 50, give or take. Cal had come up. "Maybe 45. Hard to count in that." Brennan looked south and east. Open range. No fence lines this far out. "We go after them," he said. "Takes time," Cal said. "I know it takes time." "We've got a schedule." "Cal." Brennan's voice was quiet. "We go after them." They spent the rest of the day and the following morning in retrieval. Rowan kept the camp at the hold point with Jesse and Pete, who stayed back because Pete knew cattle and knew the ones that had scattered needed riders who understood pursuit, not hands who'd get lost in the recovery effort. She made food. She kept the fire. She kept Jesse busy. In the afternoon of the second day, Cal came back with 31 cattle, and Theo and Danny, all of them looking like the land had tried to swallow them and spit them out. Brennan came back 2 hours after that with 11 more. That's 42, Cal said. There were more, Brennan said. There were. Cal looked south. 7 or 8 unaccounted. They could be 5 miles that direction by now. Brennan stood at the edge of camp for a long moment, looking south with the expression of a man doing a calculation that didn't come out in his favor, no matter how he ran it. We can't lose another day, Cal said quietly. We're already— I know. Brennan turned. He looked at the recovered herd, at the tired horses, at the men who needed to eat and sleep before they did anything else. 7 or 8 head against the debt payment math. Yes, Cal said simply. They sat down to eat. Rowan had made rice and salt pork with dried apples cooked in what passed for a sauce, and it was not the best thing she'd ever made, but it was hot, and it was enough, and the men ate it without complaint. Danny sat with his elbows on his knees and his head down between bites. Theo had a cut on his forearm from a piece of debris the storm had thrown, not deep but ragged, and Rowan cleaned it after dinner without asking, and he sat still for it without complaint. Thank you, he said, when she was tying off the bandage. Don't get it dirty, she said. It's a cattle drive, he said. Everything's dirty. Then don't get it dirtier than you have to. He smiled at that, small and tired. She went back to the fire. Brennan came to sit beside her after the others had gone to their bedrolls. He'd been quiet all evening in a way that was different from his usual quiet. Tighter, the silence of a man running numbers in his head and not liking any of the results. 193 head, he said, against 206. That's still enough, she said. At 62 a head, it's about $800 short of what I need. Then we negotiate. She stirred the fire. Hendricks doesn't know what we need. He knows what the cattle are worth. That's not always the same conversation. You think you can get more than 62? I think if we walk in there with 193 healthy head of Angus cattle after an 8-day drive, we have something worth negotiating with. He looked at the fire. I've never been much good at that kind of talking. I know, she said. He looked at her. I've been watching you for 2 weeks, she said. You're good with cattle, you're good with land, you're good with people who work for you because you're fair and you don't ask for more than you give. But talking to a buyer who's trying to take advantage of you. She paused. That's a different skill. And you have it. I've been underestimated by enough men in enough rooms that I've had to develop it. Yes. He was quiet a moment. The fire shifted. Somewhere in the dark, a cow moved. The drive isn't done, he said. No. What's the terrain like from here? She'd been studying the map every evening. 40 miles of decent ground, then the creek bed section you mentioned. That's where we're going to have to be careful. She looked at the fire. And the weather's not going to hold the whole way. I can feel it. He didn't ask her to elaborate on what she meant by feel it, which she appreciated. He just nodded. We move at first light, he said. I know. I'll have food ready by 5. He didn't move yet. He sat by the fire and she sat beside him, and the night was enormous around them, and neither of them said anything for a while, which was its own kind of conversation. The creek bed section hit on day 6. Rowan had been watching the terrain change since morning, the grassland breaking up, the ground becoming more textured, shallow drainage cuts appearing and then deepening as they went north. The geology out here was old and layered and unpredictable, and the cattle felt it before the riders did. The herd moving with more resistance, the lead animals stopping and starting in a way that slowed everything down. Cal rode point with the careful attention of a man who had done dangerous work long enough to respect it. He was finding the line, the path through the creek bed terrain that kept the cattle moving without putting them in ground that would break a leg or bog a hoof in the soft spots along the banks. It was slow, slower than Brennan's schedule had budgeted. They were 3 hours into the creek section when Jesse's horse went down. Not dramatically, not a full fall. Scratch had been picking his way along a rocky section of bank when his left front hoof found a soft spot in a way that torqued his leg wrong. The horse stumbled, caught himself, went to his knees. Jesse, to his credit, went off clean without panicking the horse, rolling clear and coming up on his feet with the presence of mind to grab the reins before Scratch could bolt. But when Scratch stood up, the leg was wrong. Not broken. The angle was wrong for a break. But he was not weight-bearing on it, and the way he moved when Jesse led him a few steps confirmed it. "Bad sprain," Cal said, riding up. He crouched and ran his hands down Scratch's leg. The horse stood for it, trembling slightly. Could be worse, but he can't carry a rider. Jesse was standing there with the reins in his hand and a look on his face that was trying not to be what it was. He was 19, and this was his first real drive, and his horse was hurt, and they were 6 days out and still 30 miles from Wichita. Rowan climbed down from the wagon and went to Scratch. She ran her hands along the leg the same way Cal had, slowly, feeling for heat. The horse lowered his head and breathed carefully. "He can walk if we don't push him," she said. "Can you lead him?" Jesse nodded. "Then you lead him. Tie him to the wagon for the rough sections and lead him on the flat." She looked at Jesse's face. "He's going to be okay." "You don't know that," Jesse said. "No," she said, "but I know it's not as bad as it looks right now, and that's enough to work with." Jesse swallowed, nodded. He took up the reins and started walking. She climbed back to the wagon bench. In her peripheral vision, she could see Brennan watching. He caught her eye and gave a small nod that meant something she chose not to overinterpret. They moved through the creek bed section in 5.5 hours. Not fast. The cattle hit 3 bad spots where the ground was too soft, and Cal had to reroute the lead animals while Theo and Danny worked the flanks in rock and roll terrain that was hard on horses and harder on riders. Rowan drove the wagon through sections where she was genuinely uncertain whether the wheels were going to hold, the old wagon creaking and shuddering over the rocky crossings. Nobody quit. That was the thing. Nobody looked at the terrain and said, "This isn't worth it." Nobody sat down at the wrong moment. Pete worked the drag with the same quiet steadiness he'd brought to every mile of the drive. Danny pushed through the bad sections with his bad arm held tight to his side and didn't mention it. Cal read the land ahead like a man who'd been reading land his whole life and wasn't going to stop now. On the north side of the creek section, when they hit flat ground again, Cal pulled up and let the herd spread and settle, and he sat on his horse and looked back the way they'd come, with an expression that Rowan had not seen on his face before. Not relief, exactly, but something adjacent. Something like the feeling of having made it through a thing that could have gone worse. That evening, camp went up on open grassland with Wichita a day and a half out, and Rowan made the last of the dried apples into a kind of rough cobbler using the cast iron and the remaining cornmeal and enough sugar to make it matter. And when she set it in front of the crew, Danny Cho looked at it and said, "Is that dessert?" "Roughly," she said. He ate 2 helpings. Jesse sat with his plate on his knees and Scratch tied to the wagon wheel behind him, and the horse was eating grass and standing on all 4 legs, favoring the left but bearing weight, which was better than the morning, and Jesse kept turning to check on him every few minutes with the helpless devotion of someone who couldn't do anything else. "He's still eating," Rowan said. Jesse turned back. "Yeah. That's good. Horses that are in real trouble stop eating." "Okay." He paused. "Thank you. For earlier. I didn't do anything. You told me it was going to be okay. I said it wasn't as bad as it looked." "Same thing," he said. She thought about arguing and decided it wasn't worth it. "Eat your cobbler," she said. He ate his cobbler. Brennan found her at the fire after camp had gone quiet, the way he'd been finding her at the fire every evening since day 1. Not announced, just there, as if the fire was a place they'd agreed to meet without ever discussing it. 193 head, he said. All present. "Good," she said. "Tomorrow afternoon we'll see the stockyards." He was quiet a moment. And then Hendricks. She looked at the fire. She'd been thinking about this conversation for 3 days. Not dreading it exactly. She didn't dread things, as a rule, because dread was a way of fighting a battle twice, but thinking through it, the way she thought through a recipe or a route, finding the weak points and deciding how to address them. "What do you know about Hendricks?" she asked. "Thomas Hendricks, 50-something, second generation. His father started the contracting business, and he took it over. He's got a reputation for paying fair, but not over." Brennan looked at the fire. "And he knows how to read a desperate seller." "He won't know we're desperate," Rowan said. "We are, though. That's between us." She turned the ladle in her hand. "When we walk in there, We're walking in with a healthy herd after an 8-day drive, which is what people do when they have options. We don't tell him we don't have options. He'll know about the bank situation. Word gets around. Word gets around eventually. We're going to talk to him before eventually. She looked at Brennan. You need to let me lead the conversation. He was quiet. I mean it, she said. I know that's not easy, but you love this ranch and it's going to show, and Hendricks is going to see it and he's going to use it. The person who talks to him needs to be someone who can walk away from the table. Can you walk away from the table? Brennan said. You've been working toward this for 2 weeks. She looked at the fire for a moment. I can make him think I can, she said. That's enough. Brennan sat with that. The fire burned. The cattle moved softly in the dark. Jesse was asleep behind her with his back against the wagon wheel and one hand still loosely holding Scratch's lead rope, even in sleep, and the horse stood quiet over him with his head low. All right, Brennan said finally. You lead. She nodded. He didn't move to leave. Rowan. His voice had changed register slightly. When this is done, whether it goes the way we need it to or not, I want you to know that what you did on this drive, he stopped. What you've done since the storm, that first night. You don't have to. I know I don't have to, he said. I'm choosing to. He looked at her. Nobody had to do any of this. You could have gone to Woodward. You could have left after 2 weeks like you said. You didn't. And I don't entirely understand why, but He picked up a stick and turned it in the fire, which was the gesture of a man who needed something to do with his hands when he was saying something that mattered. I'm grateful, is what I'm saying. Rowan was quiet for a moment. The fire crackled. The beans needed somebody to pay attention to them, she said. He looked at her. I'm not good at saying things either, she said. Don't read into it. But she didn't look away. And he didn't look away. And the fire burned between them while the cattle breathed and the stars turned and tomorrow was coming with everything it had in it, good and terrible and uncertain in the exact proportions that the world always served those things up. Neither of them moved for a long time. They saw the Wichita stockyards from 2 miles out, the pens and loading structures rising from the flat Kansas landscape like something that had been dropped there from a different world. The smell reached them before the sight did. That thick, layered smell of a place where thousands of cattle had come and gone over decades, worked into the soil and the wood and the air itself. The herd picked it up, and the lead animals slowed, and Rowan watched Cal ease them forward, patient and steady, not forcing, just maintaining the direction. Jesse was walking. He'd been walking since the creek section, leading Scratch on a loose rope, and the horse was moving better this morning, still favoring the left but putting full weight on it when the ground was level. Jesse had slept beside the horse 2 nights in a row and hadn't mentioned it, and nobody had commented on it. You should ride in, Rowan told him that morning, into the yards. He looked at Scratch. He can walk it, she said. You shouldn't arrive on foot. Jesse had climbed back into the saddle for the first time in 2 days with the careful deliberateness of someone who was afraid of what he'd find. Scratch had walked forward without protest. Jesse had exhaled and not said anything, and Rowan had gone back to the wagon. They came into the Hendricks livestock yard at 10:30 in the morning, 8 days and approximately 162 miles out of the Hale Ranch. The cattle moved into the receiving pens with the exhausted relief of animals that had been told for days to keep moving and were now finally being told to stop. The pen gates closed. Cal dismounted and stood at the fence for a moment, just looking at the herd with the expression of a man completing a private accounting. Brennan came up beside Rowan at the wagon. 193, he said. It had become a kind of mantra over the last 2 days, the way people repeated numbers they needed to be true. 193, she confirmed. The Hendricks office was a low building at the north end of the receiving yard. Wood frame, nothing fancy, the kind of building that was built to work in and not to impress anyone. A man was already coming out the side door as they approached. Mid-50s, thick through the chest, wearing a canvas jacket that had seen as many miles as some of the cattle in those pens. He walked with the authority of someone who knew that the ground he was walking on belonged to him. Thomas Hendricks. He looked at Brennan first. That was automatic. Brennan was the man, and men like Hendricks operated on automatic. He looked at the herd in the pens, He looked at the crew, road-worn and dust-colored and standing the way people stood after 8 hard days. Then he looked at Rowan. She looked back. "Hail," Hendricks said to Brennan, extending a hand. "Mr. Hendricks." Brennan shook it. "This is Rowan Mercer. She'll be speaking for us today." Hendricks' hand had been moving toward a follow-up gesture, and it stopped. He looked at Rowan again. Not hostile. He was too practiced for that, but recalibrating. "Ms. Mercer," he said. "Mr. Hendricks." She didn't offer her hand first. "You want to look at the cattle before we talk numbers?" It wasn't a question. He appreciated that, she could tell. A man like Hendricks had no patience for people who tried to negotiate before he'd evaluated what he was buying. "I do," he said. "Take your time," she said. Dad. He took 40 minutes. Rowan stayed at the fence while Hendricks walked the pens with the man she assumed was his buyer. Younger, with a clipboard, making notes. She watched Hendricks the way she'd watch a pot on a stove she didn't know well, tracking the temperature without touching it. She watched where he stopped and how long he looked. She watched what he pointed at and what the clipboard man wrote down. Brennan stood beside her. He was doing a creditable job of looking neutral, which she knew was costing him. Cal was on her other side, silent. Pete had taken the horses to water. Danny and Theo were at the wagon, eating what was left of the morning's biscuits. Jesse was still on Scratch, walking him slowly along the fence line on the far side of the yard, keeping him moving. "He's been at the Angus pens for 15 minutes, Brennan said quietly. "That's good," she said. "Is it? A man who isn't interested moves faster." After 40 minutes, Hendricks came back to the fence and stood across from them with the clipboard man behind him. He had the expression of someone who had completed the assessment and arrived at a number and was now considering how to present it. 58 ahead, he said. For the lot. Brennan's jaw tightened. Rowan felt it beside her without looking. "We drove 160 miles to get here," she said. Her voice was level. "In November. Through a blackout storm that scattered 40 head. We came in with 193 healthy cattle, and your own buyer just spent 15 minutes looking at the Angus section." She paused. 58 isn't a fair number. "It's the number given the condition of the herd after a long drive," Hendricks said. "Trail-driven cattle lose weight. They're tired. There's a discount for—" "Your buyer counted the Angus individually," Rowan said. "He doesn't count individually when he's going to bulk discount. He counts individually when he's evaluating quality." She held Hendricks's gaze. "So we both know these cattle are worth more than 58. Hendricks looked at her with slightly more attention than he'd started with. 60, he said. 64, she said. Something flickered in his face. Not anger, closer to interest. "These animals have trail weight loss I'll have to feed back into them before—" "These animals were driven by experienced hands and fed and watered on schedule for 8 days, Rowan said. "Cal Briggs has been working cattle in this state for 20 years, and he managed this herd the way a man manages something he's going to have to answer for. They're not thin." She tilted her head slightly. "You know they're not thin. Your buyer told you they're not thin." Hendricks looked at the clipboard man who was examining his notes with the focused attention of someone who had been told not to react to anything. 6150, Hendricks said. 63, Rowan said. He looked at her, really looked at her, the way he might look at something that had surprised him in a field. Not threatened, not angry, just genuinely recalibrating what he was dealing with. "You've done this before," he said. "I've bought things before," she said. "And I've sold things. The principle's the same." "What's the principle?" "That both sides need to be able to live with the number when it's done." She met his eyes. 63 is a number you can live with. 58 is a number you'd be embarrassed to tell people you paid for this herd if they saw it. A long pause. The stockyard sounds filled the silence. Cattle, the creak of pen gates, a loading truck somewhere on the far side of the yard. 6250, Hendricks said. Rowan looked at Brennan. It was the first time she'd broken her gaze from Hendricks. Brennan gave the smallest nod she'd have missed if she hadn't been watching for it. She turned back to Hendricks. "Done," she said. They shook on it. His grip was firm, and she matched it and held his gaze through it, and when he let go, she could see in his face the specific expression of a man who had lost $2 a head more than he'd intended, and was not entirely displeased about it. "Your office for the paperwork?" she said. "My office," he agreed. The paperwork took an hour. Rowan sat across from Hendricks at a desk that was covered in the organized clutter of a man who worked constantly and filed occasionally, and she read every line of the contract before she signed anything, which seemed to mildly surprise him. "You want to just look it over, and I'm looking it over," she said, without looking up. She found one clause in the payment terms that was ambiguous in a way that could have cost them 2 weeks' wait on the wire transfer, and she put her finger on it and said, "This needs to read within 5 business days, not within a reasonable business period." Reasonable is a word that means whatever the person using it wants it to mean. Hendricks looked at the clause, looked at her, called his secretary in and had the language changed before she signed. When it was done and the papers were filed and the number was committed, $12,162.50, wire transfer within 5 business days to Brennan's account. They walked out of the Hendricks office into the Kansas midday, and Brennan stood in the yard and looked at the sky for a moment without saying anything. Cal was waiting by the fence. He read Brennan's face and said nothing, just nodded once. "We did it," Jesse said. He was still on scratch. "Right? We did it?" "We did it," Brennan said. Jesse let out a sound that wasn't quite a yell and wasn't quite a laugh and was probably both. And Scratch startled slightly, and Jesse steadied him automatically. And then Pete Rawlings, who said 30 words a day on a good day, said, "Damn right." And that was enough. Rowan was already walking back toward the wagon. She could feel something in her chest that she didn't entirely know what to do with. A pressure, not unpleasant, the way it felt when something had been held tight for a long time and was finally being allowed to release. She got to the wagon and put her hands on the side rail and stood there for a moment. Brennan's hand appeared beside hers on the rail, not touching, just close. "You got us $2 extra ahead," he said. "$250, she said. "That's nearly $500 above what I was expecting to walk out with." "I know the math." He was quiet, then, "How'd you know he'd move?" She looked at the stockyard, at the pens where the Hale cattle were now someone else's concern. "Because he came out of that office before we even got to the fence. A man who's planning to lowball you and walk away doesn't come out to meet you. He makes you come in." She turned and looked at Brennan. He wanted to do business. He just wanted to do it on his terms. Brennan looked at her for a moment. "What?" she said. "Nothing." He pushed off the rail. "Let's find somewhere to feed this crew a real meal before we start back." They ate at a diner on the south side of Wichita that had booths and a counter and a menu with 11 items on it, none of which anyone had to cook over a campfire. Jesse ate a chicken fried steak and a side of mashed potatoes and 2 pieces of pie. Pete ate slowly and with concentration, the way a man ate when he was trying to make a good thing last. Danny called someone from the payphone on the wall. His family, Rowan guessed, from the way his whole posture changed when the line connected. Theo sat across from Cal and they talked in low voices about the drive for most of the meal. The kind of talk that was half debrief and half something that didn't have a word for it. The thing that happened between people who'd been through something hard together and were still sorting out what it meant. Brennan sat across from Rowan. He ordered coffee and a beef sandwich and ate half of it and then just sat with the coffee, which was the behavior of a man too tired and too relieved to have much appetite. "You should eat," she said. "I'm eating," he said, picking up the sandwich. "You're holding the sandwich. That's not eating." He took a bite. "Better?" "Marginally." He put the sandwich down, looked at her. "When we get back, Watts is going to have something else. Some other angle. Probably," she said. She'd been thinking about this. "You read the loan documents," he said. "You saw something I didn't." "I saw the same thing you saw. I just followed it farther." He waited. "The reassessment clause," she said. "Watts mentioned it in the ranch house like it was already triggered. But the clause requires a formal appraisal filed with the county before it has any legal standing. I looked at the copies you had, and there's no appraisal on file." She picked up her coffee, which means he was bluffing, or he was going to file one quietly and then tell you it had been there all along. Brennan's face had gone still. "Can he do that?" "He can try, but if we pay the note in full, which we can now, the clause becomes moot. There's nothing to trigger." She looked at him. "We need to get that wire transfer confirmed. and get to the bank before Watts does anything procedural. How fast? Fast, she said, as soon as the transfer clears. He nodded slowly. He picked up the sandwich again and this time actually ate it, and she could see him shifting from the relief of the negotiation into the next problem, which was the shape of how his mind worked. Always the next problem, never quite letting himself rest on the one that had just been solved. She understood that. She recognized it because she did it too. The drive back was different from the drive north. Not easier. The miles were the same miles, and the weather didn't give them any favors. A cold front pushing down from the north on day 2 that kept the temperature in the low 30s and made camp nights genuinely miserable. But the quality of the difficulty was different. Going north, they'd been driving towards something uncertain. Coming back, they were driving towards something that had already been decided, and that distinction ran through everything. The way the men rode, the way they talked at camp, even the way they moved through the cold. Jesse's spirits were high enough to be occasionally annoying. He talked more on the return trip than he had in the entire outbound leg, processing everything: the storm, Scratch's injury, the stockyard, the diner, out loud, with the enthusiasm of someone experiencing an event in real time and in retrospect simultaneously. On day 3 of the return, riding alongside the wagon, he said, "Can I ask you something?" "You're going to ask me regardless," Rowan said. "How'd you learn to talk to a man like Hendricks like that?" She thought about it. "Necessity," she said. "That's not really an answer. It's the true one." She kept her eyes on the trail. When you spend enough time being the person nobody expects much from, you either start expecting the same thing or you decide to make it useful. She paused. "People don't see you coming. That's not nothing." Jesse was quiet a moment. "Is that why you kept moving, town to town?" "Partly. What's the other part?" She didn't answer immediately. The wagon creaked over a rough section. Ahead, she could see Cal's silhouette at the head of the trail, steady as he always was. "I didn't know where I was going," she said, "so everywhere felt temporary." "And now?" She didn't answer that one. Jesse, to his credit, didn't push it. What? They were 4 miles from the Hale Ranch when they saw Watts's truck parked at the gate. Rowan saw it first. She said nothing, just noted it, and after a moment, Brennan rode up alongside the wagon, and she saw his eyes go to the truck and his jaw set. "He's early," Brennan said. "He's watching," she said. "He knows the drive timing. He's been waiting." "For what?" "To see if we made it." She clicked the horses forward. "Let him watch." They brought the remaining cattle, the 167 that hadn't been sold, the core herd that would rebuild from, through the East Gate pasture in the late afternoon light. And it was not a triumphant return in any cinematic sense. It was cold, and the cattle were tired, and the men were tired, and the ranch looked exactly as it had when they left. Which was to say, it looked like a place that had been struggling for a long time. But the lights were on in the house. Rowan had arranged with a neighbor's wife to keep an eye on things while they were gone, and the woman had apparently kept the stove fed because there was smoke from the chimney and warmth met them when Brennan pushed open the back door. Watts knocked on the front door 20 minutes later. Brennan was still in his coat. Rowan had put water on. She heard the knock and heard Brennan cross to the door, and she stayed in the kitchen and listened. "Mr. Hale," Watts's voice, even and professional as always. "I heard you were back. How was the drive?" "Done," Brennan said. "I see. Well, I wanted to come by and discuss the matter of the—" "Come into the kitchen," Brennan said. Rowan heard footsteps. Watts appeared in the kitchen doorway and saw her and paused, not quite covering the pause. "Miss Mercer," he said. "Mr. Watts." She didn't offer coffee. "Sit down." He sat down, because she said it with the tone of someone who wasn't making a suggestion. Brennan sat at the head of the table. Rowan sat across from Watts. "The note," Watts began. "We have the funds to pay the note in full," Brennan said. "Wire transfer confirmed this morning. Clears in 4 business days. We'll be in your office the day it clears." Watts blinked. 1 beat, 2. The recalibration happening behind his eyes. That's good news, Mr. Hale. However, I do need to advise you that the reassessment clause has not been formally filed," Rowan said. Watts looked at her. I checked with the county assessor's office before we left for the drive, she said. This was a liberty with the timeline, but she had checked the documents, which amounted to the same thing. There is no formal appraisal on file that would trigger the clause as written, which means the clause is currently inactive. She put her hands flat on the table. If you file one now, today or tomorrow, the date on the filing will be after the date of our payment commitment, which would make any subsequent action based on that clause legally questionable. She met his eyes. And I think you know that. The kitchen was very quiet. The stove ticked. Watts looked at his hands, then at Brennan, then at Rowan. You've had legal counsel, he said. I've read the documents, she said. Carefully. Another pause. She watched him. He was not a stupid man. That was the thing about Watts. He was a man who worked within systems and knew how to use them, but he also knew when a system had been outmaneuvered and the cost of pushing further was higher than the benefit. If the payment clears in full, he said finally, the note is satisfied and the matter is closed. Yes, it is, Rowan said. He looked at her with the expression of a man who had come into a room expecting a particular kind of conversation and gotten a completely different one. Not quite respect, not yet, maybe not ever, but something in that neighborhood, an acknowledgement. He stood up, picked up his hat. I'll expect you in the office when the transfer clears, Mr. Hale. We'll be there, Brennan said. Watts left. The front door closed. The truck started in the yard and pulled out onto the road. Cal was in the doorway from the back hall. Rowan didn't know how long he'd been standing there. He'd heard enough, judging by his face. Legal counsel, Cal said. I read the documents, Rowan said again. Right. The corner of his mouth moved. You did. Brennan sat at the table for a moment with his hands flat on the surface, looking at nothing in particular. Then he said very quietly, It's over. Nobody said anything for a moment. The stove continued its small sounds. Outside, the horses were in the barn, the cattle were in the pasture, and the Oklahoma night was coming down cold and clear over all of it. It's not over, Rowan said. She stood up and went to the stove because the water was hot, and there were people in this house who needed something warm in their hands. The note's paid when the wire clears. The ranch is yours outright. That's the beginning. That's what I meant, Brennan said. She looked at him. The beginning, he said. That's what I meant. She turned back to the stove. She made the coffee. She filled the cups and set them on the table, and they sat in the kitchen, her and Brennan and Cal, who pulled up a chair without being invited because he had earned the right to be in this room for this moment. And they drank the coffee in the particular silence that came after something had been decided. The crew came up from the bunkhouse an hour later, all of them, because Cal had evidently said something on his way through. They stood in the kitchen and the doorway, and Brennan told them, briefly and without flourish, that the payment would clear and the ranch was safe. And Jesse made the sound again. The not quite yell, not quite laugh. And Danny Cho put his hand over his face for a moment, and Pete Rawlings said nothing, but his eyes went red at the corners. Theo looked at Rowan across the room. She held his gaze. He gave her a small nod. The nod of someone who had made a decision and was now on the right side of it and knew it. She nodded back. She went to the pantry. She had enough for a real meal. She'd planned it on the last day of the drive, worked out what she had left and what the neighbor woman had kept stocked and what she could make from the combination that would be worth sitting down together for. She tied on her apron and started pulling things from the shelves, and Jesse appeared at her elbow almost immediately. What do you need? He said. Onions, she said. All of them. And don't cry on them this time. I don't cry on them, he said. Every time, she said. He got the onions. He cried on them a little. Neither of them mentioned it, which was the way it had always been, and probably always would be. The wire transfer cleared on a Thursday morning, 4 days after they'd come home. Brennan got the confirmation at the bank in Kingfisher, and he and Rowan drove the 40 minutes back to the ranch mostly in silence, which was not an uncomfortable silence. It was the silence of two people who had been through enough together that quiet had stopped being something that needed to be filled. He'd written the check himself, sitting at the bank manager's desk with Gerald Watts on the other side of the table, looking at the number with the particular expression of a man who had miscalculated and was not going to admit it. The check cleared the note entirely. No partial payment, no refinancing, no 10-year arrangement at elevated interest. The whole thing, done. Watts had signed off. He'd been professional about it, which Rowan respected more than she would have respected anything less. A man who lost gracefully was easier to deal with than a man who made losing into a scene. When they'd walked out of the bank into the cold November air, Brennan had stood on the sidewalk for a moment, and Rowan had stood beside him, and neither of them had said anything about what had just happened in there. There wasn't much to say. The thing was done. On the drive back, somewhere on Route 9, Brennan said, "Jesse wants to stay." She'd known that for a week. "What did you tell him?" "I told him I'd have to figure out if I could keep paying him." "Can you?" He looked at the road. "If we run this right, yeah. Not lavishly, but fairly." He paused. "I've been thinking about something, about the structure of it." She waited. "My father ran this place the way his father ran it. Owner on top, hands below, clear line between." He tapped the steering wheel. "But these men, Cal, Pete, Theo, Danny, Jesse, they drove those cattle. They held that herd through a blackout storm and a creek section that should have broken us. They did that because they chose to, not because they had to." He glanced at her. "I don't think the old model is right anymore. Not for what I want this ranch to be." "What do you want it to be?" "Something worth working for," he said. "Something where the people doing the work have a reason to care about it the way I care about it." She thought about that. About Pete's face when he'd said, "makes a difference." About Theo deciding to stay. About Danny on the phone with his family after the sale. His whole posture changed. "Profit sharing," she said. "Partial ownership, maybe. Over time." He said it carefully, like he'd been turning the idea over long enough to know its weight. "Not immediately. But a structure where a man who puts 5 years into this place ends up with a stake in it." She looked out the window at the Oklahoma land going past, brown and flat and wide under the November sky. She had spent 12 years moving across land like this without ever feeling like any of it had anything to do with her. "That's not nothing," she said. "No," he agreed. "It's not." She told herself she was going to leave in December. She told herself that the way she'd been telling herself things for 12 years, with the comfortable certainty of someone who had decided something and not yet been tested on whether they actually meant it. She had the Woodward job card still in her pack. She could contact them. The position was probably filled, it was 6 weeks later, but there were other positions in that direction. There were always other positions in that direction. She did not contact them. What she did instead was spend the weeks after the drive doing the things the ranch needed. She winterized the kitchen properly, resealed the window that leaked heat, got the stove adjusted so the hot spot on the left was manageable, organized the pantry in a way that made inventory fast and waste minimal. She taught Jesse to make 4 things from scratch: biscuits, beans, rice, and a beef stew that didn't require her supervision. She was a demanding teacher, and he told her so. "You're worse than my high school football coach," he said one afternoon, after she'd made him redo a batch of biscuits because the texture was wrong. "Your football coach was trying to win games," she said. "I'm trying to make sure you don't eat cardboard when I'm not here." He looked at her sideways. "Are you leaving?" She didn't answer that. She handed him the baking powder. "Again," she said. He made them again. They were better. Not perfect. The bottom browned a little fast because he was still learning the stove's temperament. But better, and she said so, which from her he'd learned to treat as high praise. Cal watched all of this from the comfortable distance of a man who had learned not to interfere with things that were working. He had a way of being present without being intrusive that she'd come to value. He'd do his work, come in for meals, contribute to whatever conversation was happening without dominating it, and then disappear back into his own interior the way competent private people did. One morning in late November, she found him at the fence line on the north pasture, the same place she'd brought him coffee the morning she'd told him about the drive plan, and she brought him coffee again. He took it the same way he had the first time, without surprise, like it was a habit they'd established. "Theo's staying," he said. "I know." "He told me last night, said he'd been thinking about what you said to him in the cold storage." She hadn't known he'd remembered that conversation so specifically. "What'd he say about it?" "He said you told him there was a difference between staying because there's nothing better and staying because something's worth fighting for." Cal drank his coffee. "He said he decided this was worth fighting for." She didn't say anything to that. She looked at the pasture, the cattle moving slowly across the brown winter grass, breath steaming in the cold air. "You were right about him," Cal said. "I was guessing," she said. "Good guessing." "Most reading of people is just pattern recognition," she said. "You see enough people in enough situations, you start to recognize what a person's going to do before they do." Cal turned to look at her. He had that stripped-down, load-bearing face that she'd learned to read fairly well over the past weeks. "What do you recognize about yourself?" he said. She looked at the fence post. "That I stay longer than I plan to," she said. He nodded slowly, like she'd confirmed something he already knew. "That's not always a flaw," he said. Jesse came home in December. That was how she thought of it, coming home, because he'd driven to his family in western Kansas for 10 days and come back, which was a different thing from what she'd half expected, which was that he'd go and find reasons to stay. People his age found reasons. It was the age for it, but he came back on a Tuesday afternoon with his truck loaded up with things that implied permanence: a better coat, a box of books, a cast-iron skillet his mother had sent with him. He appeared in the kitchen doorway, holding the skillet like an offering. "My mom seasoned it already," he said. Rowan looked at the skillet. It was a good one, well-used and properly black, the kind that took years to develop. "Put it on the hook," she said. "Left side." He hung it on the hook. He stood back and looked at it beside the others. "She said to tell whoever was teaching me to cook that she appreciates it," he said. "She also said to tell you that I've been cooking wrong my whole life, apparently." "You weren't wrong," Rowan said. "You just had gaps. She said you should come visit sometime and she'll show you her tamale recipe. Tell her thank you." He sat down at the table. He was doing the thing he did sometimes where he had something to say and was working his way toward it. She'd learned to wait him out. "When I was home," he said finally, "my mom asked me if I was happy out here." "What did you tell her?" "I told her, yeah." He looked at his hands. "She asked why, and I didn't have a clean answer. I said the work was hard, and the pay was okay, and the food was—" He stopped. "I said the food was the best I'd eaten since her kitchen." Rowan kept working. She didn't look up. "She said that sounded like home," Jesse said. The kitchen was quiet for a moment. Just the fire in the stove and the cold outside, and the particular sound of a winter afternoon on a working ranch. "Eat something," Rowan said. "There's stew left from noon." He got up and served himself, which he now did without being told twice, and that was its own small kind of answer to whatever question was underneath what he'd been saying. It was Brennan who finally said the thing that had been in the room for weeks. Not dramatically, not with any particular setup. It was a Thursday evening in mid-December after supper, when the bunkhouse had gone quiet and Cal had gone to do his final rounds, and the kitchen had the particular stillness of a room that had fed people and was resting from it. Rowan was at the table with the supply ledger, doing the month-end inventory. She'd started keeping the ledger 3 weeks after she arrived, and it had become the kind of task she did automatically, without being asked, because it needed doing, and she was the one who knew how. Brennan sat down across from her with 2 cups of coffee and put one within her reach and sat with his own. She finished the line she was writing. He said, "I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer it honestly, not strategically." She looked up. "Are you planning to leave?" he said. She put down the pen. "Because if you are," he said, "that's your right, and I'm not going to try to talk you out of it. You came here because of a storm and a dead radiator, and you've stayed because I don't entirely know why you've stayed." He wrapped his hands around the cup. "But I need to know, not for the ranch, for me." She looked at him. This man who'd ridden into a blackout storm to find a strayed fence post and come home with her instead. Who ran numbers in his head at 10 o'clock at night and needed coffee he didn't drink. Who'd stood at a bank desk and paid off a note that had been trying to swallow his life for 3 years and walked out without making it into a speech. "What would it mean," she said carefully, "if I stayed, practically?" "Practically," he said, "I'd want to formalize the arrangement. Wages, room, a stake in the operation over time. Same structure I'm building for the crew." He paused. "And not practically. I'd want you to be here because you wanted to be here, not because you ran out of reasons to leave." She was quiet for a moment. "I've been running for 12 years, she said. "I got good at it. Got so I didn't even know I was running. I just thought I was moving. She looked at the ledger, at her own handwriting in the columns. The first week I was here, I told myself I was staying because of the beans. Then I said it was the drive. Then I said it was Watts and the legal clause. She stopped. I've been very creative about my reasons. Brennan waited. The truth is I don't know how to stay, she said. I've never done it long enough to learn. That's not a no, he said. She almost smiled. He'd said that to her once before, about Cal, in a different context. She'd liked it then too. The refusal to accept ambivalence as an answer. No, she said. It's not a no. He looked at her across the table in the kitchen that had come back to life, in the house that was breathing right again. Then stay, he said, and figure out how as you go. That's what the rest of us are doing. She looked at the coffee cup he'd put within her reach, at the ledger with her handwriting in it, at the hook on the wall where Jessie's mother's cast iron hung beside hers. She picked up the pen. She turned back to the ledger. I'm going to need the spring supply list from Cal by the end of the month, she said. Brennan was quiet. And the fence repair schedule, she said. If I'm going to budget the operating costs through April, I need to know what the materials run. I'll get you both, he said. He didn't say anything else. He sat and drank his coffee, and she worked on the ledger and the stove made its small sounds. And outside the December wind moved over the Oklahoma land the way wind had been moving over it for longer than anyone in this story had been alive. That was how it started. Not with a declaration, not with anything that would make a good headline. Just two people at a kitchen table deciding in the quietest possible way that this was the place they were going to be. Yeah, spring came the way spring always came to that part of Oklahoma. Tentatively at first, then all at once. The grass came back green across the pastures, the kind of green that seemed almost aggressive after the long brown of winter, and the cattle moved differently in it, the way animals moved when the season gave them something back. Brennan had put his partnership structure in place by February. He'd worked it out with a lawyer in Kingfisher, not Watts's bank's lawyer, a different one, a woman named Patricia Okafor, who charged fair rates and asked good questions and did not, as far as Rowan could tell, have any particular interest in the outcome, except getting the documents right. The arrangement was this. After 3 years of continuous employment, each ranch hand began accruing a small ownership stake, capped at 5% per person. It would take time. It was designed to take time. Long enough that the people accumulating the stake would understand what they were accumulating and why. Cal, who had been there 11 years, was retroactively credited and became the first to hold actual paper. Cal read the document Brennan handed him at the kitchen table one February evening. He read it twice. Then he folded it carefully along its existing crease and put it in the inside pocket of his jacket, which was where he kept things that mattered. You didn't have to do this, he said. No, Brennan said. I wanted to. Cal nodded once. That was all. Jessie, when his time came, reacted with considerably less restraint. He'd been warned the document was coming. Brennan had walked him through the structure. But when he actually held it in his hands, he stared at it for a long moment, and then looked up at Rowan, who happened to be the nearest person. I own part of a ranch, he said. A very small part, she said. Of a ranch, he said. Put it somewhere you won't lose it. He put it in his boot, which was not ideal, and she made him take it out and put it in the lockbox in the bunkhouse that nobody ever used for anything, which was now being used for this. The spring Brennan planted the east field with alfalfa. It was a gamble. Alfalfa needed water, and the east field had drainage questions he hadn't entirely resolved. But Cal had looked at the soil composition and the grade and said he thought it would hold, and Cal's judgment on land had never been wrong in 11 years. Rowan watched the planting from the kitchen window one morning and then went outside because she was tired of watching from windows, which was something she'd been telling herself more lately. She walked out to where Brennan was working the cedar along the east fence line, a slow back-and-forth progress across the field. He stopped when he saw her coming. He had dirt on his jacket and his face, and the expression of a man who was genuinely enjoying what he was doing, which was something she'd noticed more of since December. The tight set around his eyes when he looked at ledgers was mostly gone. The drainage, she said. Cal thinks it'll work. He looked at the turned earth. I think it'll work. What if it doesn't? He considered that. Then we try something else in the fall. He looked at her. That's the job. You try things, and some of them work. She stood beside him at the edge of the newly turned field and looked at it. At the ranch behind her, the house, the barn, the bunkhouse with its stovepipe smoke, the corrals where the spring calves were beginning to appear, at the big flat Oklahoma sky above all of it. She had a thought that she turned over carefully, the way she turned over things that mattered, that she had arrived in this place with nothing except a dead truck and a pack she could grab fast, and that somewhere between the beans and the drive and the kitchen table at 10 o'clock at night, this place had come to mean something to her that she didn't entirely have words for. It wasn't just the work, though she respected the work. It wasn't just the people, though she'd come to care about them in the particular gruff way she cared about things, which was not with speeches, but with cast iron and supply lists and showing up. It was that here, for the first time in 12 years of moving, she felt like her size was right. Not too much. Not the wrong piece in the wrong room. Here, her stubbornness was useful. Her directness was valued. Her ability to feed people and read situations and hold a line in a negotiation, those weren't things she had to apologize for or sand down to fit. She thought about the woman she'd been on that road in the storm, sitting in the dirt in the dark, holding her pack against her chest, thinking with a kind of flat acceptance that maybe this was just how it ended. No drama, no conclusion, just a woman who'd spent her whole life being too much, finally running out of road. She hadn't run out of road. The road had just changed direction. She still wasn't sure she knew how to stay. She wasn't sure she'd learned to be sure of it either. Some damage from a long time running didn't fully repair itself. It just got incorporated, became part of the architecture. But she was learning. She was learning what it felt like to wake up in the same place 2 mornings in a row and have it not feel like failure. She was learning that a kitchen could be yours even if you didn't own the house. She was learning that belonging wasn't a place. It was a decision you made and kept making. Every morning you got up and chose to be where you were. The calves are coming in strong, she said. Yeah. Brennan looked at the corrals. 6 in the last 10 days, good signs. Pete's been watching the south fence. She'd noticed this, Pete's quiet vigilance. He's taking it personally. He always has. Brennan said it warmly, which was different from how he'd have said it 6 months ago. She turned to go back in. She had bread rising and it needed attention, and Jesse was supposed to be watching it, but Jesse's attention was not always reliable on its own. Rowan. She stopped, turned. He was standing in the turned field with the spring light on him, and he looked like what he was. A man in the middle of a hard life that was going better than it had been, doing work he believed in, on land he loved. He wasn't handsome in a magazine way. He was something better than that. He was present. When I found you in that ditch, he said, I wasn't going out looking for a solution to anything. I was looking for a fence post. She waited. But you were the better find, he said. I want you to know I know that. You weren't just someone who showed up and helped and stayed long enough to become part of things. He stopped, working on the words. You weren't welcomed here. You were, the right word is chosen. You made choices that kept you here, and I kept making choices that I hoped would make that possible. And I think those are different from what I would have done if I'd just been grateful. He paused. Does that make sense? She looked at him standing in his east field in the spring light. It makes sense, she said. Good. He turned back to the cedar because he was not, as he had established early on, good at sustaining the moment after the important thing had been said. The bread's going to burn. It's not going to burn. She turned toward the house. Jesse's watching it. That's my point, he said. She walked back to the house. She was almost at the door when she heard from the kitchen Jesse's voice. Oh, no. And then the sound of something being moved quickly off a burner. She opened the door. The bread was fine. Jesse was holding it with the oven mitt she'd sewn back together twice and looking at it with the expression of someone who had gotten away with something. I was watching it, he said. You were watching it so well you nearly burned it, she said. Nearly isn't actually, he said, setting it on the cooling rack. She looked at the bread, at the kitchen, her kitchen, the stove she'd learned to manage, the cast iron on the hooks, the pantry she could inventory with her eyes closed, at Jessie, who had cried on the onions and grown into something she hadn't predicted and wouldn't have traded for a more predictable version. Set the table, she said. Noon's in an hour. He got the plates down. He set them out without being told twice, which was the distance he'd traveled in 6 months, and which was the kind of thing that didn't make a good headline either, but was, she'd come to understand, the actual substance of a life. The small distances traveled, the small things learned, the quiet daily choosing to stay and do the work. There is something people rarely say out loud about finding a place to belong, which is that it doesn't announce itself. It doesn't come with a sign or a moment of clarity where the music swells and you know. What it comes with, usually, is a gradual accumulation of mornings. You wake up in the same place long enough and one day you realize you haven't thought about leaving in a while. And that silence is the answer. Rowan Mercer had spent 12 years believing that the problem was the places she'd been. That the right place was somewhere else, down some other road, that she'd know it when she got there. She'd been wrong about that. Not completely wrong, because place matters, the right circumstances matter, the right people matter enormously. But the part she'd been wrong about was the waiting. The idea that recognition would come from outside, that some place would reach up and claim her. It didn't work like that. You had to reach back. You had to decide in the ordinary middle of an ordinary morning that this was the thing worth staying for. And then you had to keep deciding it, because belonging wasn't a condition that arrived fully formed. It was a practice. It was the same as anything else worth doing. You got better at it the more you did it. She'd learned this in the kitchen that smelled like wood smoke and cast iron, and the particular blend of other people's habits and her own that happened when people shared a space long enough. She'd learned it feeding men who needed to remember that someone thought they were worth feeding. She'd learned it on a 160-mile cattle drive in November, and in a negotiation with a man named Hendricks who'd underestimated her, and sitting across from a banker at 10 o'clock in the morning with the note paid in full and nothing left to threaten anyone with. She'd learned it from a boy who cried on onions, and a foreman who said things once and meant them, and a quiet man who ate slowly because he wanted to make good things last. She'd learned it from a man who rode into a blackout storm for a fence post and came home with something worth considerably more, and who had the particular rare decency of knowing the difference. The bread cooled on the rack. The spring calves moved in the south corral. Cal came up from the fence line and washed his hands at the pump, and Jesse set the table and Pete came in from somewhere wiping his boots at the door, which he'd started doing in November and kept doing because Rowan had mentioned it once, and he was that kind of person. She made the noon meal. She always made the noon meal. She made it the way she'd made everything since that first night with the ham hock and the beans, and 5 men eating like they'd forgotten they were allowed to, with attention, and with care, and with the understanding that feeding people was not a small thing. That it was, in fact, one of the oldest ways of saying what was otherwise hard to say. That I see you, that you're worth the trouble, that this table is yours as much as it is anyone's. She set the pot on the table and called out the back door, not because they wouldn't come on their own, but because calling them in was also something she'd been doing since November, and it had become its own kind of language. They came in. They sat down. They passed the pot around the table in the ranch house kitchen in the late autumn. No, in the spring that had come because they'd held on through winter. And they were imperfect and tired and not everything they wanted to be, which is to say they were people, and they were hers, and she was theirs. And that was enough. That was, it turned out, more than enough. It was exactly the right amount.